North Carolina's DA justifies murder by cop in Andrew Brown shooting. South Carolina's governor tells death row inmate, pick your poison. Tulsa Race Massacre survivor tells U.S. Congress, sorry won't cut it. Another virus is set to go viral. The South shall rise again, from floodwater that is. Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies take a big dip in the market, and entertainment loses another icon. Into controversy we go. It's a day at the races again, in our non-stop world, and in this magical number 5 installment of the Balanced Reality Report. For death row prisoners in South Carolina, USA, it's the pilot or the bullet. Pilot as in electric pilot, and bullet as in firing squad. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster signed into so-called law a bill that forces death row inmates to pick their poison, sort of. The new law dictates that death row prisoners must choose between death by firing squad or electric chair. South Carolina is one of several states that has had to put a halt on executions due to a lack of lethal injection drugs. Quote, the families and loved ones of victims are owed closure and justice by law. Now we can provide it, unquote, McMaster said on Twitter on Monday. You may recall 2 weeks earlier, Arkansas Department of Corrections expedited the executions supposedly due to dwindling number of lethal injection drugs. That did not stop the state from putting to death an innocent man by the name of Liddell Lee.
Good afternoon, I'm Cody Alcorn.
And I'm Victoria Carmen. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster signed a new law today, and for the first time in a decade, death row inmates could be executed.
That's right. We did some research and found out the last execution in the Palmetto State was back in 2011. It was by lethal injection. Inmates now have the option to choose the electric chair or lethal injection, but a shortage of drugs needed for lethal injections meant the South Carolina Department of Corrections could not carry out those executions. So now the governor has signed a bill that means death row inmates can choose now between a firing squad or the electric chair. We did ask the governor what this bill means for the families of victims who have been waiting for justice.
The important thing is that the system is able to function. And the death penalty, which has been in South Carolina for, I think, since the very beginning, was not able to function because of the way our particular one was written. And that has now been accomplished, has been fixed, so that justice may proceed.
We did some checking and found there are currently 37 inmates on death row in the Palmetto State. We should also mention right now we did reach out to the Department of Corrections, and they do not have a system yet in place to how they will carry out the firing squad.
I had to wonder what South Carolina Governor McMaster was referring to about the South Carolina death penalty law now being quote-unquote fixed. I went to the website for the state of South Carolina to see whether the death penalty verbiage had been revised, and if so, when. As of this broadcast, the last and latest change would be the so-called options clause that the South Carolina governor signed into law. Prior to this change, death row prisoners could opt for lethal injection if the drugs were available. Otherwise, electric chair or firing squad were the only available methods. It does not sound like much of anything was changed or updated in this law. What should be addressed is the appeals process and the questionable clemency practices by many of these governors with racially biased track records. In 1921, hundreds, if not thousands, by the truckload of so-called white mobs from Tulsa and surrounding counties participated in the murdering, pillaging, and burning of an Aboriginal district called Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Mrs. Viola Fletcher, now 107 years old, was a resident of the economically thriving town of Greenwood when the massacre occurred. She is one of 3 remaining survivors of the massacre. She testified before the United States Congress regarding restitution and not just a pathetic apology from the U.S. government.
Survivors of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre are testifying before a House Judiciary Subcommittee today. Mobs of white people, including city officials, attacked black residents of Tulsa's Greenwood district. It was known at the time as Black Wall Street. Hundreds of black people were hospitalized and thousands left homeless. The death toll is unclear, but could be as high as 300. A 2001 Oklahoma commission recommended reparations, but survivors have still not received direct compensation. A 107-year-old survivor of the massacre told lawmakers she is seeking justice and told them of the horrors she experienced.
I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot. I will not. And other survivors do not. And our descendants do not.
It will be 100 years since the massacre on May 31st. The 3 remaining survivors are suing the city and county of Tulsa for reparations.
Local farmers use crop dusting planes to drop boxes of dynamite and firebombs onto Aboriginal-owned homes and businesses. Nearly 15,000 residents were left homeless, and every Aboriginal enterprise was ran out of town. From 1863 to 1985, thriving economic Aboriginal towns and cities have been burned to the ground, and their surviving Aboriginal residents left homeless. In all of these instances, Aboriginal men did fight back and took a toll on the marauding so-called white mobs, but they were outnumbered and outgunned, especially when the mobs, who were often deputized on the spot, had local, state, and federal government on their side. Recent historical accounts mention only 8 instances of Aboriginal communities being decimated by so-called white mobs. Atlanta 1906, Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma 1921, Chicago 1919, Rosewood, Florida 1923, Washington, D.C. 1919, Knoxville, Tennessee 1919, New York City 1863, East St. Louis 1917, Detroit 1943, Philadelphia 1985. You might notice that 1919 was an extra, specially violent year, with many Aboriginal massacres. It was referred to as Red Summer because most of these attacks happened during the summer of 1919. These were not just attacks, these were land grabs by the so-called white mobs, supported by local and state governments. I mentioned 1985 in reference to the bombing of the MOVE organization home by the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the police department, and subsequent burning down of nearly 3 city blocks of Aboriginal-owned homes. History books and news reports state that the bombing by helicopter of the MOVE home was the first time Americans were bombed by air by an American government. But, as you just heard, Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921 was the first time an American community was bombed by air with the approval of so-called white-run local government. I had an American history professor back in high school who used to say that deputies are the armed claws of a parasitic hegemony. Well, in North Carolina last week, militarized sheriff's deputies of Pasquotank County were declared justified in their multiple gunshot murder of an Aboriginal father of 7 children, Andrew Brown, who was slowly driving away from the heavily armed horde of police. Most of the fatal wounds, according to local coroner, were in the back of Andrew Brown's head, indicating that he was not posing a threat to the police. North Carolina District Attorney Andrew Womble defiantly proclaimed that the shooting of Andrew Brown by the police was justified.
After reviewing the investigation conducted by the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, Mr. Brown's death, while tragic, was justified because Mr. Brown's actions caused 3 deputies with the Pasquotank County Sheriff's Office to reasonably believe it was necessary to use deadly force to protect themselves and others. Mr. Brown's conduct did not merely risk injuring officers by the time of the shooting, Brown had made 2 aggressive driving moves, which caused his vehicle to contact Deputy Lunsford on both occasions. When the officers approached Brown with their guns drawn, his response was to maneuver his car and flee. Brown was undeterred by the officers yelling for him to stop, show me your hands, or by Deputy Lunsford attempting to open the driver's door. Even after backing into a corner with no escape, but to maneuver his vehicle directly at the officers, Brown continued the felonious assault by using his vehicle as a deadly weapon and made contact a second time with Deputy Lunsford. Law enforcement officers, particularly Deputy Lunsford, were on foot and directly in the path of the vehicle being operated by Brown. Lieutenant Judd was located on the corner of Roanoke Avenue and Perry in a white unmarked Crown Victoria, and Dare County officers, Sergeant Ruth and Investigator Johnson, were operating unmarked vehicles in the area to assist. All of these officers were potentially at risk from Brown's operation of the vehicle. Brown threatened the life and safety of the officers on the scene and any possible civilian bystanders, giving a reasonable officer a compelling reason to end the encounter. The law does not require officers in a tense and dangerous situation to wait until the moment a suspect uses a deadly weapon to act to stop the suspect.
Attorney for the Brown family, Bakari Sellers, has filed an action to have police body cam video footage and an SBI report released. SBI is an abbreviation for State Bureau of Investigation. It is a state-level detective agency in the United States. They are plainclothes agencies which usually investigate both criminal and civil cases involving the state and/or multiple jurisdictions. This virus stuff is for the birds, no pun intended. But another wave of bird influenza poses another epidemic risk, according to the World Health Organization. The first known cases allegedly occurred in Russia last December, when 7 poultry factory workers supposedly got diagnosed with symptoms of the zoonotic disease, which has been linked to poultry and other species of fowl. Fast forward to last week, and an article in SciTechDaily.com with a headline that reads, "Global spread of highly pathogenic H5N8 avian influenza virus is a serious public health concern."
Russia has reported the world's first case of the H5N8 bird flu being passed to humans from birds. The World Health Organization says it's now gathering more information to assess the public health impact. Joining us now to break it down is Bloomberg's Jason Gale from Melbourne.
Hey, Rumi, how are you?
Hi, Jason. What do we know about it so far?
Yeah, so we know this is a highly pathogenic strain of bird flu that's been detected in many countries in Europe and Asia over the past few years. And if confirmed, this would be the first time this particular strain has been known to infect humans. Apparently, the infected people had no symptoms. They obviously had no disease. And the virus isn't reported to be spreading from person to person, which means the people caught it from contact with birds, probably poultry. And Russia reported an outbreak of H5N8 in backyard poultry in an area near Kazakhstan in August last year.
And remind us why we should be worried about the flu.
Flu has been the virus that public health officials have worried the most about in terms of its potential to cause a pandemic. Like SARS-CoV-2, it's a respiratory virus that spreads easily between people. But it's also way more prone to mutating and swapping genes with other flu viruses, creating new strains that humans may not have any immune protection against. Also, waterfowl and migratory birds are considered to be the natural reservoirs of flu viruses. And these birds migrate long distances. So there's a lot of opportunity for them to disseminate their viruses across wide areas and to infect other animals like pigs and people.
And it does look like the WHO is looking into this bird flu, but what are authorities doing about it? What can they do about it?
Authorities in Russia have said that they're already working on a prototype vaccine, which is very common when new influenza threats are detected. Virologists try to isolate and characterize the new strain. And in Russia, they will be trying to share that information with a global flu surveillance network so that centers around the world know how to detect this virus. And there will be intense interest in learning whether the virus is capable of both causing disease in people and being transmitted from person to person.
All right, that's Bloomberg's Jason Gale from Melbourne.
Is it just me, or has anyone else noticed that so-called outbreaks of zoonotic viruses have been on the rise ever since the increase or proliferation of transgenic crops? At least 4 southern states were hit by devastating end-of-spring storms that caused flash flooding and forced many residents of places like Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to evacuate. Louisiana and Texas were reported to be the hardest hit.
Unfortunately, the news is not good. It's terrible weather in the Deep South, especially Texas and Louisiana. Heavy wind and pouring rain caused deadly conditions on the ground, including flash flooding. Hundreds of people in Louisiana had to be rescued from the rising water, and the worst may not be over. Janet Shamlian is in hard-hit Baton Rouge. That's the state capital, as you know. Janet, good morning to you. So sorry about this story.
Gale, good morning to you. This is the aftermath of flash flooding in Baton Rouge. Take a look at the water line on this house. It is about 4 feet high, and just about every vehicle up and down this street was submerged after a relentless storm.
Thunder and lightning overnight as storms ripped through the region. Some interstates looking more like rivers.
It was terrifying, though.
In Baton Rouge, it was flash flooding. This woman was able to get her children and a few belongings out of her first-floor apartment as it filled with water up to her chest.
Everything is gone. Everything.
Entire neighborhoods underwater, filled with abandoned cars along submerged streets. Across the state, hundreds of rescues.
Don't do it!
These Good Samaritans stopping a motorist about to drive into high water. Officials confirming one person died inside this pile of cars caught in the flooding. Governor John Bel Edwards declaring a state of emergency as areas like Lake Charles, still recovering from hurricanes Laura and Delta last year, were overwhelmed by more than a foot of rain.
It was just a couple of weeks ago that President Biden was in Lake Charles to discuss infrastructure and hurricane recovery. And here we are with another natural disaster.
Imagine coming back to your home after the storm and finding mud everywhere, including in your mailbox. And there is more severe weather in the forecast for today. Anthony.
All right, Janet, thank you.
Summer is not even here yet, but it seems the season is off to a tumultuous start already. Violent storms near end of spring usually signal a harsh season ahead. The after effects from all the flooding in these regions also reveals the urgent need to address old and failing public infrastructure. Every U.S. president from the last 60 years has ignored century-old public water systems and earthquake-vulnerable buildings like schools. Supposedly, the current U.S. President Joe Biden has pledged $2 trillion to address the infrastructure problems. Power and water system failures during the winter season in states like Texas are telltale signs that federal government input is a day late and a dollar short. The American Society of Civil Engineers, or ASCE, gave the U.S. public infrastructure that includes bridges, highways, public transportation systems, drinking water systems, inland waterways, railroads, and ports an overall D on its quadrennial infrastructure report card. Though there were some modest incremental improvements made to some of the nation's infrastructure categories during the last administration, it was not enough. According to the ASC organization, that is. For example, of the 617,000 bridges in the U.S., 42% of them are more than 50 years old, and more than 46,000 of them are rated as structurally deficient or in poor condition, not necessarily at risk of collapsing. Crumbling infrastructure costs every American household $3 $8,300 in hidden costs a year, according to ASCE, from lost time and increased fuel consumption while sitting in traffic jams, to extra car repairs due to poor road conditions, and of course, increased insurance costs for those who can afford insurance in the first place. That would mean the poorest people would take the hardest hit financially. We go from failing U.S. public infrastructure to falling cryptocurrency prices. Is there any connection? There's always a connection. The diamond, or gold bullion of cryptocurrencies, experienced its lowest dip since its inception. I'm speaking, of course, about Bitcoin. Cryptocurrency experts say that periodic dips are normal, but never this low. Popular 4chan user screen-named Insider posted on the cryptocurrency forum a day before the big dip that the recent 40% drop in Bitcoin price was due to market manipulation through excessive leverage trading or a coordinated sell-off and immense greed by wealthy investors who wanted to bankrupt one particular rival investor and get the price at a low for other wealthy investors then to buy in at, in expectation of a bounce back.
Cryptocurrencies went on a wild ride today, wiping out recent gains before recovering slightly. So what sparked the sell-off? We take a look by the numbers. Bitcoin plummeted 30% this morning to a low near 30,000 a coin, a level that it hasn't seen since January, before rebounding back near $40,000. Other cryptocurrencies also plunged, with Ethereum dropping 40% at one point to below $2,000. And Dogecoin, a meme coin that was started as a joke, fell some 25% in the past 24 hours. Cryptocurrencies spiked in recent months after Tesla announced in February that it would purchase $1.5 billion of Bitcoin and would accept it as payment for their all-electric vehicles. Bitcoin hit a record high near $65,000 last month, but Tesla CEO Elon Musk, the third richest person in the world, roiled crypto markets last week after he said that Tesla would no longer accept Bitcoin, citing environmental concerns over the computer-based mining process. That sparked a week-long slide for the currency, which lost some $250 billion in value last week. Today's fall came after China banned financial institutes from facilitating cryptocurrency transactions. But don't shed too many tears for early Bitcoin investors. The currency is still up some 300% since this time last year.
Despite what network media is saying, many alternative media channels are contradicting who or what is to blame for last week's Bitcoin crash, or dip, that is. Many YouTuber crypto expert players say that the dip had nothing to do with Elon Musk's announcements, nor with Chinese government ban on Bitcoin. For the record, China makes the same Bitcoin crypto ban every year, basically since Bitcoin's start. In fact, China is developing its own government-backed digital currency. Nearly 12 years ago, you might recall I announced a connected effort between international corporate tech giants, U.S. military et al., all working together over the last 45 to 50 years in the making of a God grid. What you are now witnessing is possibly that worldwide overhaul, aka so-called artificial reset. Then comes the wide-scale installment, commingled with real-time testing and rollout of what I termed 12 years ago as the God Grid. This God Grid plan is to design the ultimate all-knowing AI power grid, and when you think about it really, it is all connected. Weather manipulation, energy renewables, solar roofs, green appliances, it's all tied together with mining and blockchains and the so-called ecosystem, truly an economics system. Did you think ECO stood for ecological? What do you think that meant? The logic of economics? Without going off on tangents, I'll say this. So-called digital currencies will be tied in with everything else connected to this God grid. That's the so-called oneness of it all. And this will not be the future in which you want your offspring to be immersed or trapped. So make up your mind, start self-reliant communities, or face another return to slavery. Slavery is the #1 economic resource in the building and maintaining of all empires. Even contaminated history books admit to this. And finally, many in the entertainment world mourn the transition of author, writer, comedian Paul Mooney, who passed away reportedly of a heart attack at the age of 79 earlier this week at home in Oakland, California.
All right, Paul Mooney, the comedian, writer, and actor, has died. Mooney starred in Junebug, in Spike Lee's Bamboozled, and as Sam Cooke in the Buddy Holly story. But perhaps his greatest success came as a writer for one of the biggest names in comedy, Richard Pryor. Paul Mooney died at home today of an apparent heart attack. He was 79 years old.
Typically, celebrity news is not part of BRR unless there is an unspoken relevance to a story. Aside from being a master of satire and comedic writing, Paul Mooney was also a legend maker, as you heard in that report. So it makes sense to feature a report on Mr. Mooney's passing. A few weeks ago, I mentioned the transitioning of the rapper Gregory Edward Jacobs, known in the music world as Shock G, aka Humpty Hump. His passing made the BRR because of strange circumstances surrounding his demise, and of course because of the not-so-coincidental Tupac connection. While Paul Mooney's demise was also questionable, one only has to look at the numerous videos online from the past 8 years to realize that something rapidly overtook his health. I mention this because there are also reports that Paul suffered with dementia. But from those videos I mentioned, there are no obvious or even subtle signs of a man supposedly suffering with dementia. World boxing champion Muhammad Ali was also reported to have had dementia when he passed away. Years later, many rumors were circulating that he was given dementia and subsequently Parkinson's disease through a lethal injection of the chemical methylphenyl tetrahydropyranide, or MPTP, at the Mayo Clinic. MPTP is an amphetamine that causes rapid onset of Parkinsonism, according to the drug toxicity report. Even Muhammad Ali's neurologist disagreed with the so-called official cause of Ali's dementia and Parkinson's, by going on record dismissing the explanation that many blows to the head caused Muhammad Ali's dementia and Parkinsonism. With regards to Mr. Mooney, it is also quite odd that his health would deteriorate so rapidly into progressive dementia. The BRR investigators found no mention of Paul's parents or grandparents who raised him as having had dementia. That's a wrap for this episode of The Balanced Reality Report. And one thing to keep in mind, your enemies often hide among you and look almost exactly like you. Anyway, as always, special props to field and content producer Chris R., editing by A. Kanak, Balanced Reality Report theme songs by E.O. Haya, featured background music supplied by Lily J. Arulo, Michael Ramir, Francisco Alvear, and of course by the kind folks at mixkit.co. Until next time, this is presenter Pharoh. Don't you worry about a thing. Oh, and remember to support the report. Just use the links in the description for this medium. Use of any third-party audio clip content is within compliance with the terms of fair use and the Copyright Act of 107. This report has been presented for informational and educational purposes only. If you wish to use copyrighted material from this report for purposes which go beyond fair use, you must obtain permission from the copyright owner.